What's up, Bear Nation? Today on the whiteboard, we're going to talk about meat shortage. What do you do? With everything that's going on in the world today, COVID-19, the threats of World War III, rioting and protesting in the streets, there's a lot going on that's affecting supply chains, including the supply chain logistics of providing protein, meat, to North America. We've been getting a lot of questions about, Bear, what do I do? And so the purpose of this video is to explain to you what you can do, what you may choose to do to address the localized or regional meat shortages that a lot of our viewers are experiencing. For the past few weeks, we have seen the effect of the processing plant shutdowns. The meat available on store shelves has dwindled as prices skyrocket and purchase limits are imposed. These effects are now being seen in most places across the country. Here is a step-by-step guide about what you can do about it. And as always, this document is going to post for the $10 and up patrons to live there in perpetuity on Patreon. However, you are free to get out your prepper notebook and jot down some notes as we walk through the acquisition of meat, a couple of ways to deal with that, or the acquisition of protein rather, and storage of said protein, okay? So, option one, let's get right into it. Acquisition. Option one, 1A, is acquire meat, say a cow, chickens, a goat, a sheep, a deer, whatever, okay, a turkey. Turkeys, as a brief aside, are my preferred poultry for the homestead. I like them more than chickens because I'd rather butcher one 30-pound chicken than one 30-pound turkey rather than 10 3-pound chickens. It's just more effective as far as the use of my time. So acquire said meat. Then option A, 1A, is process live. You get the animal, you get some of your buddies, you get a hose, you get some bleach, you get a table, you get some sharp knives, and you go to work. And you cut it up and you bag it and you label it and then you freeze it. And I know for a lot of people that seems very challenging the first time. Like the first time you do anything, right? The first time you do anything, it probably doesn't go quite the way you want it to go, but you learn and you get better. And the more and more you do it, the better you get at it. And so I would encourage you, if you have the gumption to acquire an animal or animals and process them live. This is predominantly how we deal with meat on our homestead. Between our sheep and our goats and our turkeys and our chickens, we stay in protein. Option 1B is to book a processor. So you can look online in your region to find a processor, small processing house that will take your live cattle, your live sheep, or whatever, and process that meat for you. Typically, they're going to be more interested in doing large animals. They would rather do one cow than 50 chickens. Okay, plus transporting one cow is actually easier than transporting 50 chickens. So book a processor. You can locate them online and look at their price lists for slaughtering and processing. And I'm not going to tell you how much that's going to cost. It really depends on the processor. I'm not even going to give you a ballpark. The way things are right now, demand is so high that if I was to quote any numbers at you, you'd just get mad at me. Okay, so that's option A. Acquire the animal and option 1. A, either process live, you do the work, or book a processor, somebody else does the work. Then option 2 is to use alternative sources for protein. So this could be beans, this could be lentils, perhaps moringa. Brad at the Big Family Homestead, which is another YouTube channel that we are friends with, knows a lot about moringa. Bear does not. And so I would encourage you perhaps to go check out Big Family Homestead. They have several videos on moringa. Beans and lentils are as old as time. They are a proven alternative protein source. We have a bunch, a pallet of protein powder as well. So that's something to think about. If you're just talking about nutrition, long-term nutrition, I need macros, macro protein to put in the machine so that the machine continues to run. That's potentially an option as well. However, beans and lentils, even right now, are much cheaper than protein powder, and I would say probably store way longer as long as they're stored appropriately. So think about alternative sources. If you buy direct and you buy in large amounts, whether it's your meat or your alternative sources, you can essentially take care of a year's worth of protein at a time. If you have all of your meat preserving equipment ready to go, the freezer ready to go, everything ready to go, or for example, alternative sources, your buckets are already there, your mylar is already there, the lids are already there, everything's ready to go, that when you do it, you can essentially batch that process and save yourself a bunch of time. Rather than doing 2 buckets of beans at a time, do 20 buckets of beans. Well, Bear, that's 600 pounds. I know. But if you start buying, in bulk, a lot of people consider, and this is a brief aside, a lot of people consider buying in bulk going to Costco or Sam's Club. That's entry-level bulk buying. We consider buying in bulk literal truckloads of grain. Literal truckloads of grain. And now again, you probably cannot afford nor orchestrate a literal truckload of grain. But you and your MAG, your mutual assistance group, your community, the people that you do life with, if you pool your resources, time, energy, money, it's quite doable. It's actually far less daunting than you would think that it is. And that can be the same thing for buying a whole cow and slaughtering a whole cow, or buying a whole truckload of beans and putting up a whole truckload of beans. Okay, then let's get into preservation methods over here. Oh, by the way, goats and hoes. My wife wrote that up there so that I would remind you about the goats and hoes t-shirt that is in the store at bearindependent.com. And this is a Stay Humble and Kind sticker from the Sanctified Supply Co. Sanctified Supply Co. We love them. Okay. Meat shortage. What do we do? What do I do, Bear? Why? I just want nuggets. Here's the thing with nuggets. They're harder to shoot because they're only about this big. And once they fully feather out and they're running around there in the yard, they're very hard to get a hold of, which is why I recommend that you only keep your nuggets in either the incubator or the brooder. Don't let them get, once you free range nuggets, those little Tyson suckers are gone. Okay, now it's actually pretty easy because they're pre-breaded, usually pre-cooked. And so you just reach down there, snap the wings off, throw them in the oven, you've got food. But they're really difficult to shoot because they're little and they're fast. So do not free range your nuggets. Okay. Freezing. These are our methods that we're going to discuss. Freezing, pressure canning, freeze drying, brining, and jerking. Freezing. Wrap the cut of meat in an airtight packaging and place in the freezer. According to the USDA recommendations, most meat should be tossed at or prior to staying a year in a freezer. Around a year, according to the USDA. I think that's probably accurate. We try and rotate through whatever's in our freezer every year. For us personally, in our home, our next butcher date is January 2021. And that gives us a little bit, and that's for a whole steer. And so that will be somewhere, depending on the steer, between 400 and 600 pounds of meat. That gives us that much time to find another freezer and or use up what's in our existing freezer. Pressure canning. If you are canning meat, please use a pressure canner rather than a water bath canner. The key is to prevent bacterial formation prior to, during, and after the process. Various meats are treated slightly differently. There's a link here for a specific guide that you can follow. This, again, is on Patreon. But you can just Google pressure canning, or there's lots of good books on pressure canning. My wife has several. And there's, generally speaking, X number of pounds of pressure, say 10 pounds of pressure, for 60 to 75 minutes, depending on what it is that you're pressure canning. These are things like meat sauces. If you make spaghetti and meat sauce with meat in it, you have to pressure can it. And the heat and the pressure kill whatever bacteria is in there much more effectively than just water bath canning, because the internal temperature gets higher. And you can pressure can ground beef. You can pressure can whole chickens. You get a quart jar or a 2-quart jar, depending on how big your birds are. You can fit a whole bird down inside of. You get about 2 pounds of meat, or you can pull the meat off of a bird, your chicken, and put it in there. Fill it up just a little bit with water, and it'll make its own chicken stock. Boom. While you pressure. It's very cool. Very cool. But you need to pressure can. Don't water bath can proteins, because they won't keep, and you'll waste all of your time and all of your money, and all of your food will spoil. So pressure canning. Freeze drying. One would need to purchase or own a freeze dryer and follow the included instructions. While expensive equipment and large amount of electricity is required, this method allows for a 20-year or more shelf life. We, meaning myself, my family, my household, do not own a freeze dryer. However, my wife has been eyeballing one hard. The issue that I have with the freeze dryer, honestly, is that it costs more than my current pickup truck does. So, priorities. She really wants one. I think they're interesting, but I don't really have the budget for one. However, if you have $4,000 to drop on a freeze dryer, again, a 20-year shelf life is immaculate. I mean, that's incredible. Okay, other meat preservation methods that are not recommended. And this is a broad brushstroke, not recommended. For you, they may work for you, but for the average member of Bear Nation or somebody who's brand new to the storing of meat, this is not something that I recommend that you just jump right into. Brining. If you have a little pioneer in you, research this method for yourself. This method does require ongoing care on a regular basis, rather than a simple set it and forget it event. Brining is not the safest due to user error, and brining at room temperature is not recommended. How much fridge space do you have? Probably not enough for a whole steer. You see what I mean? And then jerking, or making jerky. While you can make jerky, technically, the method is far too labor-intensive a method for processing huge amounts of meat, such as, say, an entire cow. It is not generally recommended to rely upon jerking as a sole method of meat preservation. Some of it, yeah, for sure. Make a little biltong, good stuff. Good stuff. I mean, it's probably, in Bear's opinion, the best thing you can do with a London broil is turn it into biltong. But a whole cow, you're gonna make 400, 500, 600 pounds of jerky. It's a lot. It's a lot of jerky. And very labor intensive. Very, very, very labor intensive. So, acquisition. Recap. If you want a screenshot, there's your screenshot. Acquisition. Click. And meat shortage. Storage. Click. There's your screenshots. Okay? So, as a recap, acquisition. Option 1 is to acquire an animal or animals and process them live yourself, or book a processor to process them for you. Option 2 is to use alternative sources like grains and beans and legumes and so forth and so on. Okay? And then the storage of our recommended methods of storage are freezing, pressure canning, and freeze drying. Pressure canning is probably the most accessible right now for the most amount of people, because freezers are limited in availability, they're limited in space, and you have about a 1-year life of the food in the freezer. Pressure canning, there's all kinds of recommendations on this, but 1.5 to 2 years, pretty much no problem. And your capacity, the only limit on your capacity is how many jars you have and how much room you have to store the jars. As an aside, when you pressure can stuff, this should be stored, meaning the actual glass jars with stuff in it, should be stored not in ambient temperature, but in a controlled environment, climate-controlled environment. Don't pressure can a bunch of stuff and put them in a mini storage facility, because the freeze-thaw, as that stuff gets hot and gets cold and gets hot and gets cold and gets hot and gets cold, it severely degrades the nutritional content of the food. It changes the texture, it changes the flavor. It's not good for it. So when you pressure can, you want to take those jars and store them inside, not outside. Versus freeze drying or bucketing up food. If you put dried grains in buckets, that stuff can be subjected to ambient temperature, no problem. Typically, buckets should not be subjected to above 120 degrees, especially wheat, because at 120 degrees, the gluten in the wheat starts to break down, which makes you think, well, that's good, gluten's bad anyway, right? If you want bread, you need gluten. If you want mush, no gluten is fine. I don't want mush, I want bread, okay? So above 120 degrees, the gluten starts to break down. Interestingly, the little bugs that can and probably do live in your grain, the eggs and the insects themselves will get killed starting at 130 degrees. So if you have, say, a bag of wheat that has bugs in it, you can set your oven to 130 degrees, spread some grain out over the top of a sheet pan and put it in the oven for 30 minutes, pull it back out again, let it cool and bucket it up. And as long as it's only 30 minutes or so, it will not degrade the gluten content too much, okay? But that's a lot of work in of itself. So highly recommended that you get the grain, you put it in a bucket, in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, and create an oxygen depleted environment ASAP so that you don't get bugs in your grain. Ask me how I know. I've been there a time or two, okay? But when you put food in buckets or you freeze dry it, you can store that stuff in ambient temperature. Freeze thaw does not hurt it because there is no moisture content, or there's so little moisture content that it doesn't matter. So high moisture content has to be stored inside. Low moisture content can be stored anywhere as long as it doesn't get wet and you keep the rodents and bugs out of it. Meat shortage. That's what we got, y'all. I hope this is a blessing to y'all. Again, the entirety of this report is available on Patreon. You go to patreon.com, search for Bear Independent. It's patrons like the patrons we have there that are the economic engine of the Bear Nation. We would not and could not do this without them. So bless y'all. Thank y'all very much. If you're new here, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. Shalom, y'all.